tonight. Welcome everyone. My name is Brad Allen. I am the director of Lawrence Public Library. I want to say the library is honored to host tonight's lecture by Dr. Brent Campney. This event tonight, as you may know, is a prelude to tomorrow night's dedication of the historical marker commemorating the 1882 lynching of Pete Vinegar, Isaac King, and George Robinson. And I want to especially thank folks from Douglas County Community Remembrance Project, the Lawrence chapter of NAACP, and so many other partners like the Watkins for their work with the Equal Justice Initiative to shed light on this darker chapter of our community's history. And to share a little bit more of that, it's my pleasure to introduce our local NAACP president and Lawrence Public Library board member, Ursula Miner, and she's going to tell you more about the Community Remembrance Project and other events that are going on this weekend. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Ursula.
Good evening. As Brad said, I'm a member of the library board. I have been for years. I enjoy it. And I enjoy being president of the Lawrence Branch NAACP, which I've been for many years. I am honored to be a part of the program that brought Dr. Brent Campney here. It's pretty exciting as part of our events that we have planned. And I just want to go over the next event, which is June 10th, 2022, the marker ceremony. A marker was supplied by the EJI Equal Justice Initiative and was installed by the Lawrence City Hall property. It's on the property. It commemorates Isaac King, George Robertson, and Pete Vinegar, who were lynched on the Kansas River Bridge on June 10, 1882. The dedication will be on the 140th anniversary of the lynching. It starts at 7 p.m. and I hope to see you all there. It took us a long time to get to this point. It was a lot of hard work by a lot of groups. Too many to thank, but I do want to thank the city and Parks and Rec and Tony Wheeler and different people that helped us get to this point. Next event will be June 11th, 2022 by Barbara Higgins Dover. It will be the screening of her documentary film on a lynching titled Then Three Were Taken. It'll be at 1 p.m. and again at 3 p.m. on Saturday, June 11th, 2022, in the community room in Watkins Museum of History. Seating is limited, so you will need to register for the event. So I would go to the Watkins website, and it's on our NAACP Facebook page and the Coalition Facebook page if you'd like to get registered to attend any of those events. And like I said, I am really pleased that we are able to have this dedication ceremony and have the marker in and have a great speaker this evening. So next I will turn it over to Brad, who's the director of the library.
Great, thanks a lot, Ursula. And I'm going to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Brent Campney is a professor of history at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. And he is the author of This Is Not Dixie, Racist Violence in Kansas, 1861 to 1927, and Hostile Heartland, Racism, Repression, and Resistance in the Midwest, both published 2015 and 29, respectively, from University of Illinois Press. What a great press the University of Illinois Press is, I would just say, being a graduate of there as well as KU. Brent also won the 2018 Alice Hunley Wayne Visiting Researchers Travel Award, hosted by the University of Kansas Libraries, to conduct research on a follow-up project regarding African-American struggles for freedom in the Midwest between World War II and the 1970s. Dr. Campney received his bachelor's in American culture from the University of Michigan, his master's in American Studies from the University of Kansas, and his PhD from Emory University. I want to thank Dr. Campney very much for coming here tonight, and we're really excited to hear you speak. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and I apologize for not being there in person. I'd planned to, but unfortunately was not able to do so. But being invited to speak in Lawrence is a real honor. It's always an honor to speak anywhere, but Lawrence is a town, obviously. I did my master's degree. I was there from 1998 until 2001. I worked at the Dusty Bookshelf. I spent about every minute of my life downtown, and I actually started working on this project in the lower level of the library back in the summer of 2003. Speaking at the Lawrence Public Library is kind of everything comes full circle. So thank you very much. So I'd like to start tonight just briefly defining what I mean by racist violence. The term racial violence is the one that we typically see or use. I have noticed a shift over the last few years where more people seem to be using the term racist violence. But I think the important distinction is that racial violence could be any kind of conflict between, groups of people classified into sort of different racial groups, right? Could have racial conflict, but racist, what the term racist underscores is the power dynamic, right? So this is a majority group using violence to oppress a minority group and committing the violence openly, proudly, celebrating the violence, facing no prosecution, doing it in public ways that instruct the minority population about their subordinate role in the community. And so I think that's really important. It's racist violence underscores and maintains white domination and is important in that sense. So I'm going to speak mostly tonight about the period from 1880 until 1920. And the reason for that is mostly because the documentation is just so much better for that period. During the earlier period of Reconstruction, I use the term long Reconstruction to encompass the whole period from the end of the Civil War until the turn of the 20th century. But Reconstruction itself really just doesn't have nearly as much documentation. Newspaper articles on racist violence, would be just a couple of lines long, whereas by, say, 1890, it would cover an entire page of a newspaper. So you can really glean a lot more information. But I wanted to just talk a little bit about the earlier Reconstruction period, just to emphasize the fact that lynching is extremely common prior to 1880. If you read really any textbook on, any American history textbook, or most of the books you would read in general surrounding these subjects, suggest that there was a lynching era. You'll often see that terminology between 1880 and 1930. And research has increasingly shown over the past couple of decades that really lynching was just as common or even more common during the 1860s and 1870s. And so just as an example of Kansas, between 1864 and 1874, there were 32 lynchings, or African Americans lynched in about 20 different incidents. And that's more incidents than there were in Kansas from 1880 all the way until 1930, actually substantially more. So it really is a immediate post-war phenomenon as much as it is an 1880 to 1930 phenomenon. The first person to make that argument really effectively was a guy named George Wright, a historian who published a book on Kentucky back in about 1989 or 90. And he showed that in Kentucky, a huge number of the lynchings occurred between 1865 and 1880. In Kansas specifically, you sort of start to see racist violence really start to surge in 1864. There's 2 lynchings in that year. One is in Garnett. The other one is in, gosh, I never thought I would forget these things, but there it is. Oh, it was down in Greenwood County, rural area down in Greenwood County. And then you see a massive uptick in 1865. The first lynching is actually in Douglas County. It's in Blackjack. And Blackjack, of course, is famous for the John Brown mythology and so on. I believe there's even a marker down there. And one of the funny things about all that bleeding Kansas violence in the 1850s is that they call it the Battle of Blackjack. But, really it's about 40 guys, taking a couple of shots at each other and then dispersing. And so they give them these kind of grandiose sort of names. But really the incident in 1865 is a very important incident as well that has not been documented in nearly the same fashion. So there's 3 black men lynched in that incident, and probably a 4th. the newspaper account suggested that a fourth man was in custody of the mob and presumably was also killed. In 1865 as well, in Lawrence, a black man's house was mobbed, attacked by a mob that ransacked it, stole everything that wasn't nailed down, and destroyed the house. Over in Wakarusa Township, there was a black man murdered by a white man who then hopped on his horse and said goodbye to his neighbors and rode out of town. And same kind of violence is occurring all across the state. There are multiple murders and riots in Leavenworth, in Topeka. There's a murder. There's a lynching in Indianola. The Indianola lynching, in fact, was perpetrated by a mob led by the school teacher at the Rochester schoolhouse in Indianola. And they shot these two black teens and buried one of them alive. So that's an interesting detail. And so 1867 was probably the most violent year in terms of lynchings anyway in Kansas history. There were 9 black men lynched in the spring of 1867, 3 of them in Dickinson County, 3 of them in Fort Scott, 2 in Wyandotte, and 1 in Shawnee. So really, really terrible, sort of unprecedented violence in those first few years after the Civil War. Okay, so as I said, I want to focus though more on the types of violence and talk more specifically about incidents arising out of the period between 1880 and 1930. Okay, so between 1880 and 1930, I'm sorry here. Okay, so yeah, most studies on lynching focus on the American South. And when I went down to Emory to do my PhD after leaving Kansas, my expectation was that I was going to study Southern history. And when I got down there and I got doing Southern history, I realized I was just more interested in the Midwest than I was in the South. And so what I ended up doing was taking a Southern sort of model, which is the study of lynching as a way of studying race relations and white supremacist violence, and applying that to the Midwest. And Kansas has this, as I'm sure we all know, particularly in Lawrence, has this mythology about itself that it is sort of it was a great place for African Americans, and they came during the Civil War, and they came during the Exoduster movement, and so on and so forth. And in fact, you know, when I lived in Lawrence, I spent a ton of time at Z's Coffee, which was the Java dive at the time. And I was writing a master's thesis on race relations in Lawrence in the 1940s and 50s. And people, when I would talk to people about what I was doing, they would always say, white people would always say, you know, you won't find very much here. And then they would sort of proudly say, this is the Free State. Not everybody, but enough times that I found it really kind of extraordinary that a town that 30 years or so before I moved there was Jim Crow, didn't get an integrated swimming pool until I think 1967. And yet there was this belief among a lot of people who probably should have known better that everything had been fine. And it was extraordinary to me. And so I thought, well, if I take this Southern theory and I apply it to Kansas, will Kansas still be able to maintain this mythology? And I think, based on my findings, I think that they could not. So the study of lynching makes a lot of sense, in a sense, when you look at the South, because a place like Mississippi or Georgia or Alabama, there were 400 or 500 lynchings there between 1880 and 1930, which again is the period that most people study. And so that's a large enough sample size that you can come to a lot of conclusions. But a place like Kansas, which has a much smaller number of lynchings, you really can't do that. And because there is such a small number of lynchings, it also leads to the idea, well, there really wasn't a lot of racial violence here, right? And of course, the difference between Georgia and Kansas is that Georgia has a population of African Americans is about 30 or 40% of the state. They live in rural areas, they live in urban areas, they live all over the state. And so every town in the state is going to have its own lynching to establish white supremacy in those towns. In a place like Kansas, for reasons that I'll talk about a little bit later, the African-American population lives overwhelmingly in cities, and particularly a pretty small number of cities. And if every one of those cities has a lynching, which is more or less true, then you have a situation where every African-American in Kansas is personally affected by a lynching, even if there are only 50 or 60 lynchings in the whole state's history, right? So that was kind of what I did. I sort of adjusted for population sizes and demography and so forth, and found that, I mean, I don't think it's useful to see it as bad or worse or whatever than Georgia, but it's not really, you know, it's not a comparative thing. But certainly based on its own sort of mythology about itself, Kansas does not pass muster in that regard. So specifically, if you were in the book, This Is Not Dixie, I said that there were 52 lynchings and 37 incidents between 1861 and 1927. And with the advent of online newspaper and other research I've done, I've actually found 4 more incidents in the 1920s. One was in the teens. McCracken, the little town of McCracken, the town of Geneseo, Burlington, and Oakley. All 4 of those towns had lynchings in the 19-teens and the 1920s. So at this point, the number has risen to 56 incidents, or I'm sorry, 56 victims in 41 incidents in the period between 1861 and 1930. So not an insubstantial number. I'm sure that there were more than that, particularly in the earlier period, that just weren't documented. I found one in Baxter Springs, for example, in 1867, but there was just the one account. It was one sentence long, and I didn't think there was enough corroborating evidence to use it, but I'm sure that there were other incidents. Okay, so what is a lynching? A lynching is a targeted attack, a lethal attack, at least by the 1860s. Lynching didn't actually mean lethal violence before about 1860 to 65. It could mean lethal, it could mean non-lethal violence. But for our purposes here, a lynching is lethal violence, and it's targeted. And this is a really important key. There's a specific person that the mob is going after, and they want to get that person for some alleged crime that sometimes she committed. Doesn't mean that person actually committed the crime. And in fact, I think evidence suggests that every single incident of African Americans being lynched in Kansas, they were demonstrably innocent of the crime for which they were accused. You can just discover that by reading the accounts. So every single one of them was innocent, but the mob insisted that they had committed a crime and they were going to punish them for that crime. And I think it's important to know that there's also kind of a mythology about lynching that any black man could fill the spot. If they can't get that guy, they'll go kill this guy, and that's the same thing. Does sometimes happen. There certainly were rampaging mobs that killed people that were not accused of crimes, but for the most part, lynch mobs wanted to believe that they were killing somebody who was genuinely guilty of some kind of offense, either against the racial order, had done something that violated white supremacy, or some kind of murder or rape, which also violated white supremacy, but was a more specific type of criminal infraction. So a mob, there's a lot of discussion about what makes a mob, but for the most part, an average mob was probably between about 20 and 40 or 60 people. Some of them got very large. There was some, it was one in Leavenworth with about 8,000 to 10,000 people. That was about half the population of the city in 1901. So they could get very, very large as well. So one question that I am often asked, and particularly this is important in Kansas, there were more white people by far lynched in Kansas than there were black people. And a lot of times people will say, well, there's more whites lynched than blacks. So was it really racist? It was absolutely racist. Comparing those two things is really like comparing apples and oranges. Certainly a lynching is a mob that usually hangs a white guy illegally, and in sort of the surface level, a lynching of a black man and a lynching of a white man are similar. But what's really important to understand is when a white person was lynched, he was always a man. He was lynched as an individual, right? So, if I was lynched, I'm a white guy. If I was lynched, the newspaper would say he was a dastardly fiend and he got what he deserved. The town is better off without him. But they would probably also say something like, his sister's a wonderful person. She's, terribly upset about this. She's nothing like him. His parents are wonderful people, and so on. Go on gushing about how wonderful the family is. The family doesn't get run out of town. Nobody goes into the white neighborhood, because they're all white people, and burns down the whole white neighborhood and kicks the entire white population out of town, right? That would be absurd. With African Americans, it's exactly the opposite, right? One person may or may not be accused of a crime, but somehow all the black people are responsible, right? So one person allegedly commits a rape, burn the entire black neighborhood down, run the entire black population out. Don't refer to the victim by his name, refer to him as the Negro, because that's what he represents, right? The Negro and the Negro population, right? So it's a collective punishment against blacks. It's an individual punishment against whites. To use a more contemporary example, I'm a white guy from Michigan. When I was about 19, a white guy from Michigan blew up the Oklahoma Murrah building in Oklahoma. White men from Michigan were not rounded up, I can assure you, right? He was an individual. He and Terry Nichols were prosecuted, and he was executed. And there were even stories about how wonderful his family was, right? If 19 Muslim men blow up a building in New York, then of course you go to war with Muslim nations, you pass Muslim bans and so forth, right? So in the past and in the present, white people can be guilty individually. People of color are always guilty as a group. Okay, lynching is also very much about spectacle, right? So it isn't just about killing somebody. You don't, at least in this period, you don't just take somebody out in the woods and kill them and bury their body. You want to do it in a public place so that all the white people can participate in this. They can go down to the town square with no mask on, no feeling that they even disguise their identities, and murder somebody publicly and celebrate their bravery for doing it, claim that the individual that they murdered without trial deserved it, and so forth. And of course, nobody's going to be punished. And it's also about letting all the other black people in town know that we're going to kill this one individual, but if you step out of line, as we define that, we will do the same thing to you. So spectacle is very important, and often you leave the body, they would leave the bodies hanging for hours, and in some cases days, or it's usually, by morning the body would be taken down. That is one important distinction between Kansas and the South. In some cases, they often left bodies for quite a long period of time in the South. Okay, so there's no punishment of the mob, as I indicated. Oftentimes, the actors, the people actually doing the execution, the lynching itself, was a small group of people. In some cases, like the case I mentioned in Leavenworth in 1901, if you wanted to find killing somebody as lighting the match, in that case he was burned, one man did it. It was the father of the girl that this innocent person had allegedly murdered, and he lit a match and dropped it on this guy who'd been soaked in oil, and he was burned. But of course, there were 8,000 people around him aiding and abetting him, including police officers. So you can't really say, that's a one-person crime. It's the same thing with the case in Lawrence in 1882. You've got a group of, I think about 40 guys that actually ransacked the jail and hanged these three men off the bridge. But the reports in the Lawrence Daily Journal World suggest that a crowd was cheering lustily, if I remember the exact words, from the riverbanks. So, everyone in Lawrence knew about this or heard it and went down and participated. Doesn't mean everybody supported it, but nobody arrested anybody. Nobody was punished for the crime. Black people were afraid to be on the streets of Lawrence for days afterwards. I wanted to read you a quote. This is actually not in the book. I came across it after I published the book, but it's just a fascinating quote, I think. It's from the New York Tribune. It was published, the morning after it had been telegraphed. It says, "Not since that August day in 1863 when the rebel guerrilla Quantrell, as they pronounced it, rode into Lawrence and sacked the city with his horde of Missouri cutthroats, leaving dead bodies of 80 citizens behind, has the city passed through such a state of excitement as during the past 24 hours. If you read the Lawrence accounts, the businessmen who ran newspapers in Lawrence were pretty shrewd, and they knew that the reputation of the city was that it was a nice place and an abolitionist. And the Lawrence lynching is really different from a lot of the other lynchings in the sense that they really are not as gratuitous about racist slurs. I'm not saying you won't find them, but they really try to cover up how ugly it was in the Lawrence newspapers. I think that New York Tribune article really gives you a much better feel for the rootin' tootin' attitude that was going on. You get the sense that everyone kind of dispersed after the lynching. I do not believe that that's the case. I think you had all kinds of white people swarming downtown, swarming around the bridge, threatening black people and doing horrible things for days afterwards. The incident in Leavenworth that I've referred to now several times was the lynching of Fred Alexander, January 15th, 1901. A demonstrably innocent person who was accused of rape and murder. and was burned by this mob of 8,000 people. No effort whatsoever was made to prevent his lynching. In fact, local officials essentially brought him down from the prison in Lansing so he could be lynched, because the sheriff basically lost his nerve, and it was a disgrace. And so it allowed that to occur. On top of what I've already said about that incident and how ugly it was, they actually burned this man, Fred Alexander, in front of his house. His whole family was in the house watching out the window down the hill as they burned him. After the burning, his mother and two of his sisters came down the hill and of course started screaming when they saw his body, and the mob jeered and laughed at them and made fun of them, and so on. So, I mean, really as ugly a situation as you can imagine. So as I indicated, studying racist violence and this kind of white supremacist violence in Kansas, you really could not do a very good job if you were only studying lynchings, because there were so few of them. And yet I knew from my research that Kansas was a Jim Crow state. And I know from my study of the South that the only way you can achieve that kind of white supremacy is through terrorizing people, right? Black people are not going to say, yeah, no problem, we're happy to stay over on this side of town, give us the worst education you can, that's fine, right? They're going to fight back. They always fought back. They fought back despite this kind of violence. But the only way to really keep them down at all was to do this kind of stuff. And so I knew that those lynchings could not possibly be everything that was out there. And so I created what I call a more capacious model for studying violence. And so one of the other kinds of violence that I looked at, which has also got a fairly substantial literature associated with it, were race riots. And these, unlike lynchings, were non-targeted, right? So a lynching is a targeting of a particular individual accused of a crime. A riot is just white people going out with guns and torches and beating, shooting any black person they come across, flipping over cars and burning them, running people out of town, and so on and so forth. And race riots, of course, are, there's some huge race riots in American history, particularly the ones around World War I, Chicago, Tulsa, Washington, D.C., places like that, where in some cases, dozens of people are killed. In Tulsa, maybe as many as 300 people are killed. These are epic events. In Tulsa, I think 35 urban blocks of Tulsa were burned down in about 12 hours. So really, huge events. Kansas didn't have any of those. They really didn't have any big riots. And so you can write a whole book, for example, on the Chicago race riot. Dr. Tuttle, who's at KU, who's one of my advisors there, wrote a fantastic book on the Chicago race riot. You just can't do that with any of these incidents in Kansas. And yet, if you look at them on their own terms, right, this is something that happened in this little town. It's not well documented, but it had a huge impact on who lived in this town, what the race relations were in this town. And so it's a failure of imagination not to focus on these things and try to understand them. So the biggest race riot in Kansas history was in in Hays, Kansas, in 1869. There had been a lynching in January of 3 black soldiers off a bridge outside of Hays. Jim Liker over at Johnson County Community College has an outstanding article on that incident in the Great Plains Quarterly in about 1997. And about 4 months after that lynching, there was a riot in Hays in which 6 more soldiers were killed by a riot, and then the mob just were on a rampage, killed 2 black men who were barbers in town and drove the entire black population out of town. A few did come back, as I'll discuss a little bit later. They were kicked out again in 1871. There were a couple of more killings of blacks in 1882. And basically from that point until the 1980s, there were really no black people there. I think in 1970, there were 15, something like that. Very long-term implications of that incident. The town of Leroy or Leroy, I've actually never figured out in 20 years how to say it. It's down in Coffee County, little village, unbelievably racist community. No black people have lived there since 1864, or at least until real recently, if there are any there now. They just kicked the entire black population out in 1864 and said, you're not wanted here. And that was that. There were also several lynchings, not well documented, but very, very violent town. A third category, so lynchings and race riots are more common to study, but the third category is one that I guess sort of pioneered it. I called it mobbing. That's not maybe the best term for it, but mobbing is kind of like a lynching. It's a non-lethal lynching. So again, it's a targeted attack against somebody accused of committing some kind of a crime, and they're taken by a mob and they're beaten within an inch of their life in many cases. But the distinction is that they are not dead. And as I mentioned earlier, if that had occurred in the 1830s or 40s or 50s, they would have called that a lynching. But by the later period, that's not, to be a lynching victim by 1870, let's say, you had to be dead. And so these are people who did not die or who I cannot prove died. Good examples here, Marysville, town up in Marshall County. Interestingly enough, it's a town famous for having black squirrels. That's their whole tourism industry is around their black squirrels. If you run over a black squirrel in Marysville, you get a $25 ticket. No black people allowed though. Black squirrels, yes. Black people, no. They've never been allowed. 1870, the newspaper published a piece bragging about the fact that there were no black people there. When I say no black people, that doesn't mean no black people ever. They came and went, they were kicked out. You might get a few of them building up for a little while before they get kicked out of town. But effectively, no black people allowed in Marysville. And so in 1876, a circus came to town, and there were two black youths working for this circus, and they were accused of stealing a watch. Which is like stealing an iPhone today or something, right? So it's not exactly a capital offense of any kind. And by the way, they later proved to be completely innocent of the crime, which I suspect everyone in Marysville knew at the time. But there was a circus, and they had the big top tent and all that going on. And the ringmaster and a mob of either townspeople or possibly circus workers took these two kids into the tent, and they hanged them repeatedly in front of the crowd. Of course, loved this and hooted and hollered. It was better than they had, they thought they were going to get from the circus. And after they tortured these kids and made them confess to a crime that everybody knew they didn't commit, they took these kids down to the train station and they locked them into a cage with some hyenas that were part of the circus act. And the train left, and of course, everyone had a rip-roaring good time talking about that, right? They thought that was really funny. So obviously, if you're a black person anywhere in the vicinity of Marysville, you probably already knew you weren't allowed, and that just reinforces it. The next time that I know for sure that any black people went to Marysville was in 1903. They got beat up in the little town of Home, right outside of Marysville, and by a mob there as well. And then they went into Marysville. The guys down in Home were good enough to telegraph over to Marysville to tell them some black guys were coming, and they got beat up again in Marysville and run out of town. Another incident of mobbing occurred in Ozaki, a town that is now under a lake, in 1892. And in that case, this guy was supposedly running a brothel, but it appears that what he was really doing was he had a wife who was white. And so they put him in jail. A mob took him out of jail later in the night, took him to the edge of town, whipped him, castrated him, and ran him out of town. And he went up to Oskaloosa to try to find some place to be safe. And of course, they wouldn't let him stay, and they ran him out of Oskaloosa as well. And this is, I think, one important case. In this case, my strong suspicion is this man died. I mean, I have to imagine you lose a lot of blood from that. He was in a pretty rough condition, and he was sent fleeing from town after town. I can't prove that he died, but he probably did. Either way, he was subjected to horrible violence at the hands of a mob. But if you're only studying lynching, that incident doesn't exist, right? So you have to have a broader understanding of what racist violence is. A third kind of violence that I looked at was, or another type, fourth, I guess, type of violence was police violence. A type of violence that obviously has taken on tremendous significance in our own time and certainly throughout the 20th century. And police officers really start to perpetrate a ton of violence against African Americans in the late 19th century. And there's a direct correlation between the decline in lynchings and the rise in police violence. And so essentially, the reason there were so many lynchings in the 1860s and 70s and into the 1880s was that at that time, it was not inconvenient for powerful white people. They were okay with it, didn't affect their interests, and therefore they didn't do anything about it. But about the 1880s, and I think Lawrence is a great example of this. There's a lot of embarrassment in Lawrence about what happened. Not regret. They didn't feel bad for killing a Black person. They definitely felt bad about hurting the reputation nationally and locally. And so increasingly powerful white people didn't want that kind of stuff to happen. Who's going to want to come to move to Lawrence if there's mobs constantly rampaging, right? Who's going to want to invest in a factory in Lawrence if a mob might go burn it down, right? Who's going to believe that Lawrence is the greatest town in the Midwest for Black people if mobs are constantly rampaging and killing people, right? So for very, very selfish reasons, powerful white people turned against lynching in the 1880s, and then especially in the 1890s and around the turn of the century, with the Leavenworth incident being the sort of last straw. And then in 1902, another last straw in Pittsburgh on Christmas Day, when a mob took a kid, again, demonstrably innocent 17-year-old kid out of jail, cut his throat and hanged him as a way of welcoming in Christmas Day. So in order to prevent mobs, you have to have larger police forces. So part of the reason you don't see a lot of police violence earlier is just there really weren't any police forces. You had a marshal or a sheriff or whatever, but there wasn't a police force. So as they expand the police force, what you start to see is the police prevent lynchings. Intuitively, we always sort of think all the white people ran on this, but the reason there were not dozens and dozens of lynchings in the late 19th century is because white police officers stopped lynchings. They would often say things to the mob like, I would like to join you. If I wasn't a police officer, I'd come out there and join you, but this is my job and my professional responsibility, and so on. So they would, put these guys in cars or wagons or whatever it was at the time and get them out of town and prevent the lynching that way. Every now and again, they would show some backbone and actually stand up to a mob and say, if you try to come in here, I will shoot you. Yates Center, another all-white town down in the southeast corner of the state, they had a very brave sheriff who actually did that. Came out and gave a speech, did say, I would help you if I wasn't the sheriff, but because I'm the sheriff, you are not getting in here. And they knew he was serious and they didn't do it. So all of that is to say, as lynching goes down, as a result of police officers, they start to take over the role of the mob, right? So you see just as many killings, they're basically just as flagrant as lynchings, but now they're being done under the guise of a badge and so on. So I think there's a lot more of a story about that relationship than we know at this time. So police killings. Okay, so these police killings, usually there's two ways that these killings go down, and they're pretty closely related. But number one is that police officers would always claim, and this happened, I guess, with non-police officer whites who killed Black people too, but that the victim made a move as if to pull a gun. And if you were to Google made a move as if to pull a gun, I bet you would find 24 killings in the last 5 years in which a Black man made a move as if to pull a gun, and the officer therefore had no alternative but to shoot this person dead. In virtually every single incident in which a Black man made a move as if to pull a gun, it turned out after he was dead that he didn't have a gun. But of course, the police officer didn't know that at the time and therefore was justified in shooting him. The second argument was the self-defense argument, right? This guy was trying to kill me. Again, he made a move as if to pull a gun, and I had no alternative but to shoot him. However, in many of these cases, in all the ones I documented, because I didn't use any case where I couldn't say almost for sure that this was a flagrant racist killing, they shot these Black men in self-defense in the back of the head, right? 3 bullets went in the back of the head of this Black man who was angrily coming at the police officer. 3 shots in the back of this man who was angrily coming at the police officer, right? Unless they have boomerang bullets, you cannot shoot somebody in the back of the head who's coming at you. And this is not by any means just in the distant past. Tiger Dowdell was shot in an alley in the back of the head in self-defense in 1970. And it's a demonstrable fact, again, that he was shot in the back of the head. So if he pulled that gun and then turned around really fast for some reason, that's the only possible justification for how Officer Garrett could have shot him in the back of the head. But he was also acquitted, as every officer before him had been in the state's history. So what do some of these police killings look like? As I said, I only use cases where I can say for absolute sure that this was a flagrant killing, but I found I bet you at least 100 other cases that I'm sure were also flagrant killings, but I just couldn't prove it based on the documentation. Okay, Ellenwood, out in Barton County, all white town. There was a lot of all white towns out in Barton County. Ellenwood, 4th of July, 1899. There's a black man who comes into town. Of course, everyone's drunk and partying. He steps off the train, and because no black people are allowed in this town, the marshal comes up to him. Well, first of all, I should tell you, you have to sort of think about the psychology here. So there's a town marshal who's a white guy with a gun and a whole bunch of drunk white guys with him. They're all drinking, and a black guy comes off the train, and you can just sort of imagine, hey, you're going to let that guy be in town? So they saunter up. The police officer flanked by 20 other white guys, and he walks up and just shoots this guy in the belly and kills him. The Ellenwood Leader newspaper declared flatly that no matter what, this guy's not going to be convicted. And of course, he was not convicted, which was not a big surprise because almost exactly 2 years to the day earlier in 1897, a black field hand came to town looking for work. He was seen in the company of some white men at the edge of town, and he turned up with his throat cut and a couple of bullets in his head a couple of years before. And the police officers claimed that they were doing everything in their power to find him, which was obviously kind of an inside joke because they were not. So that's one killing. A second killing occurred down near Iola in the little town of Bassett, in Allen County in 1904. Hard to believe, but at the time, the town of Bassett was about 50% black. And a police officer flagrantly murdered this black guy in his front lawn. And the African-American population was very angry about it, demanded that he be fired and wanted him prosecuted. And the whites in town declared that they supported him. They weren't going to let him be fired. And a whole bunch of white guys took their guns and went and defended his house. They guarded him all night long to ensure that he would not be punished. So, not only do you have the killing, but again, you have a whole crowd of white people asserting that he did the right thing. We support him. He will not be punished, and so on and so forth. So here again, like the mobbings, you can see that police violence can be kind of a communal event, right? Everyone participates, everyone sees it. In the case in Ellenwood, the shooting is at the train station. Probably everyone in town saw this white police officer flagrantly murder a black guy and sort of laugh about it, and that he would not be prosecuted. Another type of violence I looked at was homicides, which are pretty obvious. An individual, one or two white guys murdering a black person. But here again, I want to just emphasize the communal nature of this. I want to just give you one example that really underscores this. Down in Garnett in 1895, on Emancipation Day, August 1st was Emancipation Day. So that's an African-American celebration of emancipation. And so this killing occurs on that day. That's already significant. There's a baseball game going on at the park between a white team and a black team. And the manager, as they call him, of the black team came out and argued with the umpire about a call. And in all likelihood, he was arguing, and that kind of annoyed the white guys who didn't think he should really have that much to say. One of them, named Charles Sargent, came out with a baseball bat and smashed this guy's head in from behind and killed him right there on the baseball diamond. It won't surprise you to learn that the reason he snuck up behind this black man and smashed his head in with a baseball bat was because the black man made a move as if to pull a gun, right? That's how ridiculous these arguments are. And so he killed this man on the baseball field. All the black baseball players chased this white guy through town. And they were, of course, furious. But the white people liked it. They said that he killed this black guy as he was, again, trying to pull a gun. And they paid his bond. They acquitted him after a 5-minute trial. They had a big celebration of him. They guarded his house. They made it clear that any black person that came anywhere near his house was going to get shot, right? So again, Garnett did not have a lynching in the 1890s, but they didn't need a lynching, right? The lynching was the baseball bat killing. The same way that Ellenwood didn't have a lynching. It was the marshal killing that guy at the train station. Bassett didn't need a lynching. It was killing the black guy on his front lawn and having the white population protect the police officer. So those are kind of the major types of spectacle violence that you see. And when you put all those together, you start to see that virtually every town in Kansas that had an African-American population of any size at all had some kind of racist killing or racist brutality that enforced the white supremacist order. The last kind of violence that I'd like to discuss is rape. And rape is very different from all these other forms of violence in the sense that those are public and spectacle forms of violence. Rape tends to be a private act. And it's very hard also to document, because while white people can claim that lynchings were justified or police killings were justified and some scoundrel had been sent to his just desserts, you really, how do you claim a rape is justifiable, right? So they typically just didn't cover it. Every now and again, you'll find reference to the rape of a Black woman in the newspaper, but it's not very common. You're much more likely to find those in the Black newspapers when those start to emerge in the 1890s. But the reason I want to talk about rape here tonight is just because there's a very prevalent idea in the historical literature, and I think this is changing, but traditionally that Black men suffered all the racial violence, racist violence, and Black women sort of had it easy. And there's a fantastic book, the best book ever written on lynching is by a guy named Fitzhugh Brundage. It's called Lynching in the New South. And it is unquestionably the best book ever written on the subject. But he has one line in there about how, I don't remember the exact words, but it is effectively the idea that Black women really didn't have to worry about racial violence. They could get away with things that Black men could never get away with. And first of all, that's not true, because when you lynch a Black man, he has a sister, he has a mother, he has children, and so forth. So that obviously affects Black women as well. You burn down a house, that obviously affects Black women. But rape was a very, very common thing, so common that it was certainly more common than any other kinds of violence that we've discussed here. And of course, the white rapists were never prosecuted, and if they were, they got away with it. Very, very rare that they were prosecuted. These rapes, some of them are the kind of rapes that you probably expect. Some guy in an alley pulls a woman in at night and rapes her in an alley. When they did that, by the way, particularly in the late 19th century, white men would often paint their faces black and then go and rape Black women, which again is just sort of a psychologically fascinating, right? That you are lynching Black men for allegedly being rapists. Then you go out and rape Black women and you paint your face black, right? You could write a dissertation just on that phenomenon. But a more common type of rape was workplace rape, where Black women who were working, who often were supporting, their families on really small salaries, and they worked as domestic workers. And so they were in the house of a white family, and white men sometimes raped them forcibly. I mean, it's all forcible, of course, but coercion, right? If you want to keep your job, if you want to be able to put food on your table, you have to engage in sex acts with me. And so that kind of sexual violence was very, very common. One example of a rape that I think really reveals a lot about the way white people thought about Black women and their worth in that respect is again in Hayes. And so I mentioned that there was a riot there in 1869 in which the entire Black population was kicked out. In 1871, at least a few African Americans had returned to town. And the reason we know that is because in that year, a group of about 4 white men broke into a Black woman's home and gang raped her. And then the next day, she and her supporters filed charges against these white men. And the white people in Hayes were furious that any white man would be arrested on the say-so of a Black woman. And they again rioted and kicked the entire Black population out of town. So that's an unusual example, and Hayes was an unusual place, but it does give you a sense, I think, of the attitudes. Finally, I'd like to talk about sundown towns. So I better stop after this because it looks like I've massively overrun my time. I had another section, but I'll stop after sundown towns. Sundown towns are all white towns, or basically, as I said, all white towns. Sometimes Black people come and go. Sometimes you'll have, maybe 20 or 30 Black people living in a town that is ostensibly a sundown town. But effectively, these are all white towns where Black people are not allowed to live. And sometimes they're not even allowed to visit during the day. A place like Hayes or Leroy or any of those places, you would not want to be there as a Black person at any point. Sometimes they put signs up at the edge of town declaring that no Black people are allowed in town, but I don't think that happened very often. I didn't find very many cases in Kansas, but it may have happened on some occasions. Two examples I would give of sundown towns. One would be Hoisington, another Barton County town out near Ellenwood, that was founded in 1888 as a sundown town. It was a little village, so there wasn't a lot of reason for any Black people to go there looking for opportunity. But in 1910, the railroad expanded its shops in Hoisington, and so it was kind of a boom, and people from all over the place went to Hoisington, including some African Americans, and they were shunted into South Hoisington, so an area south of the railroad tracks that had no services of any kind, and they weren't allowed in town. And in 1912, there was a lynching. A mob invaded South Hoisington, riddled this man with bullets, and kicked the entire Black population out. There was another case in the 1930s, which I suspect was also a lynching in Hoisington. Certainly 2 Black guys got killed on the edge of town, but they covered that one up a lot better. Second one would be Liberal, down in the southwest corner of the state. Was a sundown. It's not now. It's actually a very multiracial city now because of the packing industry. But it was an all-white town. A few African Americans started showing up there around 1908. And one night in about 1909, I'm going on my memory here, the exact dates, a bunch of white guys grabbed their guns and went out to where the Black people were living. And it's not at all clear what they did. Did they shoot somebody? Did they burn houses? Did they just say, you better leave? I have no idea. But by the next morning, the whole Black population was gone. And both of the white newspapers and Liberal ran stories about how great this was, that all the Black people were gone. Okay, I will stop there because, as I said, I've terribly run over and apologize.
That's no worries, Brent. You're fine on time. I just want to thank you for. I think the point of what is of the remembrance that is happening tomorrow night is, again, really to try to figure out some way to come to terms with these histories. And while this is a brutal and hard to listen to history, I think these are the kinds of things that we need to think about and sit with as we try to understand our history as a nation and as a state and as a town, right? And so I thank you for the research you've done on this and what you've shared with everybody here tonight. We've got a few questions here in the Q&A, and I would tell folks too, if you have any questions, we have some time that we could do some questions and answering, and I'll moderate that. One question that we have here is, the first one is, why do you think this continues to happen in the 20th century and still using Jim Crow law when reporting a crime or not?
I'm not sure. I'm not totally sure. I mean, why it's still happening. I mean, that's a great question. I don't know. I think this is a long answer, and I'll make it as short as I can. But I think as humans, we always tend to think all the bad stuff happened about 30 years ago. It seems to me that 30 years is about the period we're always willing to accept that 30 years ago things were bad. So in 1990, we would talk about, oh, back in the 60s, but now everything's great, right? All the white people I knew growing up in Rochester Hills, Michigan, denied the fact that racism existed. Probably I did too, back in the 1990s. And why don't Black people stop complaining? And if they would stop talking about it, it would go away and all that kind of stuff. We totally knew that racism had existed 30 or 40 years ago, but we believe that now it's not like that. Now, 30 years later, those same people are saying, well, sure, back in 1990, the Rodney King thing, that was racist, but we don't do that now, right? So you can always admit the crimes you committed about 30 years ago, and you can never commit the ones you perpetrate now. So why is it still happening? Well, because it's been happening since American history began in various different ways, slavery and then race, Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and it never went away. But I think we just have this mythology that we're always better in the present. And so we can't wrap our heads around the fact that we're the same creatures that we were 30 years ago or 60 years ago or 100 years ago.
I, yeah, I think I appreciate that. Here's another question for you. How did, in your research, how did Black policemen respond to white policemen's racist violence and language during 19th century Lawrence and/or Kansas? If there are any examples that you have of that.
How did white newspapers respond?
How did Black policemen respond to white policemen's racist violence and language during 19th century Lawrence and/or Kansas? If you have any examples.
That's a really fascinating question. Well, I'll tell you about an incident in Lawrence. I don't remember names at this point, but there was a Black police officer, at least one, probably more than one, but one in particular in Lawrence in 1970, who was getting it for sort of both sides after the Dowdell killing, because all the Blacks in town, not all of them, but if you'll allow me to generalize, were calling him an Uncle Tom for being a police officer. But he had to sort of deal with that. And then on the other hand, he was worried about whites killing him or burning his house or whatever the case may be. So he was very much in the middle. If you read Bill Moyer's account in Listening to America, which is published in maybe about 1971, he's got a really, really fascinating account of the Dowdell killing, where I believe it's him who talks about that. Black police officers, I mean, I don't really know how they responded. There were very few of them. My guess is that they were furious about it, but they didn't have the power to stand up to it. There's a case in Wichita in 1907 where a Black police officer attempted to arrest a white man, and he said, "You can't arrest me." And the Black man, or the officer, tried to arrest him anyway, and a mob converged on him and beat him. So my sense is that Black police officers were more or less allowed to arrest Black people, and arresting of white people had to, only white officers could do that. That's maybe not the best answer. Hopefully I came up with something there.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be difficult to find in a lot of that history and newspaper research, but it is a great question, and trying to walk that line. One question I'll answer really briefly. We have a question of whether this recording would be made available. We have recorded it. I'm not exactly certain about whether this will be on our YouTube or not. I don't know if we had discussed whether this would be put live, but if it would be on our YouTube channel. I don't have an exact answer on that. I apologize, I don't. The next question that we've got quite a few questions here. Then our next question, the person first wants to say they appreciate your passion and expertise for what you're sharing tonight. I was curious what brought you to this field of study.
Well, I'm a Canadian. I grew up in Toronto until I was 13, and I moved to Detroit when I was 13. And the first thing we studied in 8th grade history, was the first American history I ever learned, was about John Brown. And so Kansas came on my radar literally like 5 minutes after I came into the United States. It was just something about the John Brown thing that I found fascinating. And so that's what took me out to Kansas, 8 years later or something. I went to a French school as a kid. So for me, I was an Anglo kid in a French school. Anglo kids were the majority. So for me, like, otherness was French kids, white kids, and also white Americans. I never thought of Americans as being anything other than white. My others were white Quebecois and white Americans. But when I came down to Detroit, and by the way, where I grew up, this doesn't reflect terribly well on where I grew up, but the Protestant Catholic divide was much more pronounced. So for me, like Catholic, when I went and stayed with a French family when I was about 12, I remember like things that I'd be like, wow, that's because they're Catholic. Like things that I thought were weird that they did. It was anti-Catholic sort of prejudice. When I went to Detroit, everyone was Catholic. And they all hated blacks. It was a white-black thing, and I just never sort of seen that before. specifically, I saw an incident, a racist violence in 1996 at Michigan State University. And I'm just going to tell this story very briefly because it's, so I was wandering around East Lansing. I got separated from my friends and I went up to a house party and there was a keg of beer and some cups. And I just grabbed a cup. I didn't know anyone at this party, but nobody. Grabbed a cup, got myself some beer, started talking to people on the porch. And maybe about 20 minutes or half an hour later, these three or four black kids showed up and they started coming up the steps onto the porch exactly as I had done 20 minutes earlier. And these white kids who were, I was 19 and these black kids were probably about 19, but these white guys were older, maybe like 20, 25. They were bigger guys. And they just sort of went down and pushed these black kids right off the porch. And the black kids said, "Why can't we come in?" And the white guy said, "Because we don't know you and you didn't pay for the beer." Right? So here I am standing there. I don't know any of these people. I've never seen them in my life. And I didn't pay for the beer. I just walked up, took a cup because I thought I could and started drinking it. And these white kids then proceeded to just beat the hell out of these black kids. I didn't do anything. I was just so shocked. I just sort of stood there watching. But it was just a searing experience. And that had come about a year after I'd taken a sociology class at Michigan State. And I had read the book Wages of Whiteness, which Dr. Roder is now at KU, but that was really a transformative event in my life. So by the time I got to that party at Michigan State, I guess I was just ready to be able to see the hypocrisy. So that moment is probably the thing that really got me interested in racist violence. And then after that, it's just, a series of events occur, take you down one road or another.
That is a powerful thing to see. I can see, that I've similar being a KU grad and studying with Bill Tuttle and a lot of the folks that I think you came into contact with too, I think led me down these paths of trying to really discover why is this world the way that it is, and the inquiry and research that we can do to try to tell these stories and understand it better and come to some better sense of our country. Here's an attempt at a positive question here in a lot of really dark things, but another question here is asking if any of the state's political leaders, a governor or a senator, anyone like that, ever take any kind of a public position against lynching and racial violence. And are there any heroes in this story?
The short answer on the first one is no. I could go into a longer answer, but sometimes they came out against it rhetorically, like that was a bad thing to do. But when it came down to it, they didn't do anything. They put no muscle behind punishing anybody, really ever, that I'm aware of, including, up until, again, in the 1960s and so on. Racial violence just did not get punished by the powers that be. I'm sorry, and I'm really sorry, folks. I'm tired because I'm dealing with some situation up here, so I wish I was a little more on my game. But what was the second part of the question?
Oh, are there any heroes in this history?
There are lots of black heroes. There are very few white heroes. Any white heroes that there were usually were acting in self-interest, as I indicated. Like the white elites, they might come close to being heroes in terms of the fight against mob violence, but they were doing it for themselves. And rather than for black people. There is one civil rights activist named W.B. Townsend, who I wrote an article about in Kansas History back in, I think, 2008 or 9, was just a phenomenal human being. And there's lots of remarkable black heroes, but white ones, not really.
It is interesting to me kind of how singular John Brown seems to be in this story is quite unique in who he was and what he did. It's there, you don't come up with a whole lot of other folks like that. Some other questions here we have here. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so we've got time for a few more here. One is, what distinguishes towns and cities where Black communities were not forced out despite these acts of racial violence?
Great question. I would say in general, little towns didn't really need Black labor, and so they kick them out. In a city, they needed African Americans to occupy certain niches. And so essentially that's, I mean, I think I would say virtually every little town in Kansas, with the exception of some along the Missouri border that just had large Black populations going back to the 1860s, I would say virtually every town was a sundown town, at least in spirit, if not in actual policy. Little towns, I mean, just to be blunt about it, they just didn't need them, and so they didn't allow them. Black or white big cities did need them, and therefore did allow them. I'd say that's the major difference.
I think I've got time for one last question here, and a person is wondering if you could speak more to how and why white people have pushed these histories of racist violence out of communal memory.
Well, I mean, I think part of it is that one of the things that fascinates me about American discourse is that we are allowed to inherit good things, right? So if my grandfather made a lot of money, he can pass that down to me, and I can inherit something my grandfather did in the past, and I can live on a big pile of money that I did nothing to generate, right? Lots of people do that, right? And in some cases, it's based on land that was seized from Japanese Americans or African Americans or somebody else illegally, and then they made a lot of money, and that passes down to me. So nobody ever has a problem with inheriting the good stuff. But when it comes to the bad stuff, if I didn't personally do it, I didn't lynch anybody, therefore I'm not responsible, right? So it seems to me that we can either inherit the bad stuff, which is the legacy of racism that allowed, for the most part, white people to be dominant in American society today, or we can stop inheriting money and we all just sort of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps when we're born, which of course, there's no practical solution for how that would work. It's just always seemed to me, as somebody who was born into pretty fortunate economic circumstances, I am aware of the fact that I did absolutely nothing to earn those circumstances except being born to particular parents. And so, I know that my family in Canada, I'm sure they did terrible things. I'm sure they seized Indian lands. I know they did bad things to the French in terms of, discriminating against them and so forth. So I just think you have to inherit the good and the bad. And I think there's a lot of people who just refuse to. They want to believe that they're good. And this is the critical race theory thing too, right? And you can't teach little Timmy that, that his fortuitous circumstances in 2022 are built on a legacy of blood. Right. And so we have to ban the teaching of African-American history because that might make some white kids feel bad. First of all, that's ridiculous. I'm a white kid and I felt a lot better once I figured out how to think about the world, because I always knew that I had inherited things that I didn't deserve, even before I understood racism. Anyway, so I'm sorry. I'm so much more articulate usually. I apologize.
No, I hear you. And I think these are, it is figuring out how you come to terms with things that are not the better part of one's nature, right? I mean, and how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that actually can heal? I think that's what, that's what the Equal Justice Initiative is about. I think that's what about this Community Remembrance Project is coming to terms and figuring out how we heal, right? And how we move forward in a way that we, hold ourselves accountable, and then try to figure out how you move without hate and anger and love, and with love, and trying to figure out how our community all lives together in a way that is more equitable. I think that's what we're struggling to do as a nation, as a community. And so thinking about these things deeply, I think is really important. And so I will just say quickly, thank you very much for your time tonight, and for being a part of this commemoration this weekend, as we really kind of sit with our history here in Lawrence and in this nation, and as we think about how we could do better and what that means, and I think really how I don't know, we do that by learning about our past. I'd also actually love to see if Ursula has any last words that she'd like to share with folks, as really being somebody who has been a big part of moving everything forward with Carrie and so many different people. Ursula, is any last words that you'd like to share on behalf of the community project, NAACP, or just personally as a person who has spent your whole life in this town?
And spending my whole life in this town and listening to Brent talk is a lot of mixed feelings and a lot of mixed emotions, because there's a lot of stories in Lawrence that have happened, and a lot of this is just one part of it. And it just makes me think that we all have to stand together and move in the same direction. And I'm so thankful that you made this presentation. It's hard to hear, but it's needed. And I just like to thank you for doing that, and make sure everybody comes out tomorrow for our marker dedication. And I want to thank you again for your presentation. And it was honest, and like I said, we needed to hear it. And that's the only way that we are going to move forward, is to hear this and think about it and think of how we are all going to move together in the same direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ursula, and thank you, Brent. I will say, I will mention in the some of our folks who know more about the technical things here at the library, yes, this, as it was recorded and will be on our YouTube channel, and there's a link to our YouTube channel in the chat. But if you just go to YouTube, type in Lawrence Public Library, you'll most likely find us. And Brent, I hope everything is well with you and your family. Thank you so much for joining us. Just really, really appreciative you could be with us here tonight. And thank you everyone for being here tonight on Zoom. And as I say, this will be on YouTube, and feel free to share this with other people that you think that this would be valuable to, as this is now documented, and it's something that people can watch offline. It's online, I guess, but offline from right now in the future, as we want to see, or this will be here, and it'll be online to take a look at. So thank you all very much, and look forward to seeing everyone at all of the events this weekend. And thank you everyone so much for your work. Everyone, have a lovely night. Take care.